Hey, welcome to the Notcast, or welcome back. It's Sunday, 15th of January, 2023, and this is episode 264, I think, of the Notcast. Let me just quickly check. Yep, 264. And today I'm starting off a new band. So if you've been watching any of these previously, or you've dipped in and out, I have a method in my madness. Still a fair chunk of madness, but a method. And the method is that I will talk chronologically through a respective band's entire discography. And what that means is actually it's pretty intimidating sometimes, because if you don't like the early stuff, then you kind of go, what have I got to say about it? And sometimes while I go through these, I'll be listening to the early stuff again, and I'll kind of go, why didn't I like that at the time? Or that's not as good as I was hoping it would be. Certainly the REM stuff, for example, the early REM stuff, I've gone through over the past few years. I did an episode a couple of years ago where I talked about the first REM albums, the IRS years, and I was kind of like, bit harsh, truth be told. But now I'm kind of at the point where I'm like, that early REM stuff is fantastic. There's a couple of other bands I am going to do at some point. I think I might do The Shaman, and those early records are not really my type of thing, to be honest. I'm not sure some of the later ones are either, but in for a penny, in for a pound. I think if you love a band, you should be loyal and you should stick with them. And as long as the band's still trying something new, you've got to applaud that. It's when a band starts to repeat itself endlessly and it seems like it's run out of ideas. That's when I start to think that have they just stopped? Is this just another bunch of songs? Like the new Iron Maiden album, Senjutsu. I think I've listened to it once, twice, and it's been out for a year. And I've kind of listened to it and gone, it's all right, but it's just another bloody Iron Maiden album with no progression whatsoever. One thing that you cannot accuse the band I'm starting off today about is endlessly doing the same kind of thing, because today I am talking about Oklahoma's finest export, even finer than my ex-wife, and that is the Flaming Lips. I've got their early stuff here, all on CD, and I'll be really honest about it. This early stuff is not my favourite period of the band, but if you love a band, you've got to go through the whole thing. And sometimes you can only really understand how a band got to a certain place by starting at the beginning of the journey and following them through. So in the same way that I know that Piper at the Gates of Dawn and Saucerful of Secrets and more are pretty good Pink Floyd albums, they're not the type of stuff that I really kind of think of when I think, oh God, I really want to listen to some Pink Floyd. I'm not sat there thinking I want to listen to Take Up Thy Stethoscope and Walk. When I think about listening to The Shaman, I'm not sat there thinking I want to listen to Christopher Mayhew Says. And when I think about the Flaming Lips, I'm not sat there thinking I really want to listen to Hit to Death in the Future Head. I mean, this is good stuff, but it's not amazing stuff. And sometimes kind of like a band has to go through a series or a period or a process of evolution and refinement before it gets to what its final form actually is. Like Michelangelo chipping at that bit of stone, tapping away all the bits that don't look like the ancient god or goddess, or whatever the subject is of that particular sculpture. In the same way that once you start to think that you can go somewhere, if you can go anywhere, that's almost the most powerful thing that there is. When you start to refine that down and you start to go, right, instead of thinking I can go anywhere, you then start to think, now I have to actually start and go somewhere. You then start to limit all of your options down, and it becomes quite limiting, I think. So sometimes that's kind of where bands are, is when you can be anything. As soon as you start to be something, you start to close off all the other options that you can have. It's a pretty weird place to be. What I will say is Oklahoma's Flaming Lips formed in, I think, 1983 in Oklahoma by Mark Coyne, Michael Ivins, Wayne Coyne there, and on drums, I think Richard English, I think that's Richard, started with a very different sound to how they ended up. So this is the multi-disc set that features their first 3 albums and their first EP. So the EP, The Flaming Lips, released in 1984. The album, here it is, released on the 21st of January 1986. The second album on the second disc, called, oh my God, it's The Flaming Lips, released on the 6th of January 1987. And the third album, Telepathic Surgery, released on the 3rd of January 1989. So these are all albums released in January. In fact, and that's not why I've chosen this particular episode. It's just I recently got a copy of the Yoshimi Battles the Pink Robots Super Mega Box Set, and so I kind of listened to that and thought, oh, I really need to start doing my Flaming Lips episodes. So the first 3 studio albums, EPs, and some leftovers are on this set called Finally, the Punk Rockers Are Taking Acid, the early recordings of the Flaming Lips, 1983 to 1988. Those are the recording dates, not necessarily the release dates. So this, if you want to pick up the early years of the Flaming Lips, by the way, this and this particular release as well, Heady Nugs, are probably really good places to go. There's also a couple of box sets which you can get, which have the vinyl editions of the albums, and a couple of standalone albums as well. But we'll start with the first 7 albums by the Flaming Lips before we get into the stuff which I've really fallen head over heels in love for. So the first time I heard of the Flaming Lips, going way back in time, the year 2000, the worst year of my life, and it was probably about the 24th of June. The Flaming Lips were playing Glastonbury, and that was the day after Nine Inch Nails. It was the day that Chemical Brothers were playing. It was the day before David Bowie. I'd been awake for what felt like about a year, but was only about 3 days. And the Flaming Lips were playing in I think, the new band's tent, even though they'd been going for 16 or 17 years. And whilst I had very little memory about that show, I do remember going and seeing them and being really quite impressed. But because I hadn't eaten or slept properly or anything, and how much of it was me hallucinating, I have no idea, actually. I mean, certainly I remember fragments of that weekend, which means that I must have been at Glastonbury, because if you remember all of Glastonbury, you definitely weren't there. But then the other part of it was, I remember thinking, I really need to check this band out. And then I completely forgot for a couple of years until I saw them again on television. So the first time I really heard them properly in a way that wasn't basically an altered state was probably early 2003, maybe late 2002. And after that, it was Love at First Sting, as Scorpion said. This stuff, if this had been the first stuff I'd have heard, I'd have written them off in much the same way that the 16-year-old me, the first Black Sabbath I ever heard was Headless Cross, sung by Tony Martin. And I was kind of like, it's just boring geezer rock, you know? If this had been the first stuff I'd heard by the Flaming Lips, I probably wouldn't have bothered investigating further. This was the 2000 and let me quickly check the copyright date. 2002. So 2002, when Yoshimi Battles the Pink Robots came out, Flaming Lips' old record company decided that they were going to make a bit of money by reissuing the band's old stuff. And me, being budget conscious, stroke lazy, depending on your point of view, decided that the best way to get into the band that I really liked was to buy the old stuff cheap, because it was value for money. And I must admit, I've not listened to this album or the individual albums within it quite a lot over the years. So because many bands, I think when they start off, they're learning how to be and who to be. And especially if you're a band that's not got a huge amount of money and you're in a rehearsal studio, you're probably playing quite loud to be heard over the Metallica covers band next door. And also, you're limited by your options. Guitars are cheap, synthesizers are expensive, you go for guitars. So the band's first kind of configuration was Wayne on guitars, Mark on guitars and vocals, Michael Ivins or Evans, depending on your point of view, on bass, and Richard English on drums and piano. And that's the lineup which made the first EP, The Flaming Lips. And you listen to that stuff, and I listened to it earlier on today, very influenced by a lot of forerunners. So Oklahoma is not the most hip or happening place in America. And I feel I can say that because I've been there many times and I've spent a lot of time there. And yeah, I was married to an Oklahoman person once. And so it's known for oil, it's known for football. Route 66 run through it like a stick of rock. It's very windy. And my cultural experiences when I went to Oklahoma, I was pretty surprised actually, because going over there and you kind of thought, well, actually, this place is huge. I felt like I was a little Lego minifig compared to what life's like in Britain. So if you don't live in Britain, or if you haven't been to Britain, our streets are quite small. It's quite cramped. All the houses are on top of each other. You know, you've got quite literally, you've got your house, your front yard, and the pavement, and then the road. When I was in Oklahoma, it was a case. Well, here's your house, then there's your front garden, then there's a huge chunk of just random grass, then there's the pavement, then there's another huge chunk of random grass, then there's the road. Everything was bigger. It was like the whole of Oklahoma was made out of an old 90s first-person shooter where there were lots of loading screens in between the actual stuff, and just everything had so much space. Even the meals are bigger, the portions are bigger, the food is bigger. I went up a couple of waist sizes in the times when I've been over there, simply because the food is very fattening and there's an awful lot of it. And I'm kind of sat there going, is it that American sizes are different, or am I just becoming fatter? And without actually the aid of a tape measure to go, right, you're 36 inches when you land and 40 inches when you take off 3 weeks later. I wasn't able to judge that. So I've still got some clothes that I bought, which now, over 20 years later, I'm just about getting to fit into, which sounds harsh, but on the other hand, I'm glad that I kept them. And so my first trip to America was a kind of like a sense of a biblical land of plenty where everything was bigger and brasher and louder and wider and taller and hotter and colder and windier and rainier at the same time. And Oklahoma is as it says, Oklahoma is okay. It's the only place I've been which had a tornado warning shelter inside the airport, for example. It's the place of the planet that at the time I went there, I drove past. In fact, we went and drove into the remains of the shopping centre, which was subject to the fastest wind speeds on the face of the earth. Which was 316 miles per hour. It quite literally just picked up the shopping centre, the mall, and just threw it into the sky. And they ran out of money. So when we drove in, and you could still see, where the demarcations were, where the stores were, and where the car park was, and the water tower, and all that type of stuff. Bonkers place. Not saying it's a bad thing. The thing I couldn't get my head around when I went to America was guns. I genuinely couldn't get my head around it at all. Just guys just walking around with guns on their belts. And I mean, I know it's an open carry state, but I'm just sat there going, am I in Grand Theft Auto? What's going on here? But, I grew up in Birmingham, where and most of my exposure to guns were cop shows, and Paul Stanley telling me that he's got a love gun. So there was an element of being a stranger in a strange land, and Oklahoma is and was not the cultural capital of America. You think about places in the UK, for example, and you think, where's hip and happening in the UK? And you go, well, probably, Hoxton, Manchester, maybe parts of Liverpool, because the Beatles came from there. You think about America, you go, well, it's Austin, LA, San Francisco, New York. Nobody goes Norman, Oklahoma, do they? Because it isn't. It's kind of like, a suburb or a backwater. It's a place. And then you think about the cultural homogeny that we've got inside the UK and inside America, where it's really only America and then maybe a second post, kind of the UK, that have a big cultural impact in most of the world, certainly most of the English-speaking world. And you end up kind of going, I mean, Canada must have some amazing bands, but because they come from Canada, you don't hear them. In the same way that Nigeria has probably got some fantastic bands that come from it, but nobody ever hears of them because they're Nigerian. Who thinks about Brazilian rock? I don't know. Is it a genre? Does it work? Please play Brazil. Who knows? Oklahoma is one of those places where you kind of go, right, so if there is a centre of the universe, this is the place that it's farthest from. And that's not a criticism. I liked it there. It's a nice place. It had a nice temperament. And, the people were very welcoming and very lovely. But it's not where you would think one of the prime weird beard American rock bands of all time would come from. And when you listen to the first EP, The Flaming Lips, the 5 tracks that are on it, Bag Full of Thoughts, Out for a Walk, Scratching the Door, Garden of Eyes, Forever is a Long Time, and My Own Planet, you don't sit there and go, this band are going to become that band. The influences that you've got on that early EP, you kind of think about bands like Black Flag, Talking Heads, some degree of, Led Zeppelin, because everybody likes Led Zeppelin, those type of things. You can't see where this band are going to go. And it didn't sell a huge amount, and the band were a very standard configuration of guitars, bass, drum, voice. And Mark, the Wayne's brother, left after the first EP. But what you could hear in that is then the LP that came out. Here it is, which is the first disc, and finally the punk rockers are taking acid. Features the first EP as the first few tracks, and then here it is as the next 10. Plus, then you've got a number of extra bonus tracks on CD one. What you find is you've kind of got the idea of standard rock music, but it's slightly wonky. It's slightly gone wrong. You can hear the influence of early Pink Floyd. You can hear the influence of The Who, Led Zeppelin, as I said, Black Flag, Dinosaur Jr., the Dead Kennedys, even that kind of abrasive, loud rock music, because that's the tools that they had that were available at the time. The stuff that the Flaming Lips were going to become in the future was not the stuff that you were hearing here, because you're limited by your technology. In the same way that if you hear, let's say, early Pink Floyd, you're not listening to the band that's going to become the Division Bell. You're listening to four art school guys from London in the 60s who are learning their instruments and maybe played together for 50 or 100 hours by the time they get to their first EP, the Arnold Lane single. I think I might do all the Pink Floyd records in order, actually, but not for a while yet. So here it is. The first album is entertaining, ambitious garage rock. Wayne's moved over onto vocals. It's not amazing. It's not really my type of thing at all, but you can start to see the band that the Flaming Lips are going to become in that. You really can. And the same with Oh My God, released in January, again, which is effectively CD2. This set, by the way, is effectively repackaged versions of the first 3 studio albums with bonus tracks that are on there. If you don't know where to start, if you're thinking, this is an affordable entry point, really, and then you've got Oh My God, which has the number of songs that's on there and some bonus tracks that make up the end of it. So, for example, Groove Room, Jesus Shooting Heroin. Nice to know that they're always going for the controversial titles right from the off, and so on. And then we've got Telepathic Surgery, released in January 1989. That's CD3 of this set. And whilst I've listened to them all, and I've tried to give them a damn good try to find out kind of what do I think of these things. The bottom line is I'm not a huge fan of early Flaming Lips, which is becoming blatantly obvious during the course of this. The version of the band that are on here no longer exist. They haven't existed for a very, very long time. You did get, by the way, a second kind of reissue set called The Day They Shot a Hole in the Jesus Egg, which is effectively an expanded version of album 4 in a priest-driven ambulance, which was released on the 18th of September 1990. It was about this time that I started to become aware of Flaming Lips, because that's the time when I started to become aware of, music full stop. And what you'll see is actually, The Day They Shot a Hole in the Jesus Egg has CDs 4 and CDs 5, as you can tell. So effectively a continuation of what we've got previously. So this is 1989 to 1991. And it kind of tells the band story at this point. There is also, on this CD, 5 is the Mushroom Tapes, a kind of self-released bootleg of rare and unusual tracks, which later got a proper release on vinyl when the Flaming Lips moved into a more retrospective period of their career. And it also featured, I think, a number of other songs that are on top of it. So there's some bonus tracks on here. There's a couple of sub-pop singles. There's let's think, Peace, Love and Understanding, Drug Machine, that type of stuff, and tracks which the band don't play very often now, as well as I've said before, the Mushroom Tapes release, which is effectively a kind of like the first of the Flaming Lips bootlegs, which later got officially released on this set. I think the release of these was somewhat opportunistic, I think it's fair to say. somebody went, the band that we like, Flaming Lips, have become popular. We could make some money if we repress the old stuff because people will be interested in that. A lot of bands do this. David Bowie had a number of compilations released of his early material on the Decca label with names like Another Face, Images, Getting to Know David Bowie, those type of things. And whilst contractually you haven't got an ability to really kind of clamp down on those kind of exploitative releases, I think the Flaming Lips here were taking the view that if you are going to do this stuff, if you are going to repress our albums, then let's make sure we get it right. And let's make sure that it feels right and it feels correct and accurate. We had album 5, In a Priest-Driven Ambulance is album 4. Album 5, which was released on the 11th of August 1992, Hit to Death in the Future Head. And this is the first one where the band is signed to Warner Brothers, because a lot of bands got signed up. So you think about a huge amount of advances post the release of the glam metal destroying, hair metal obliterating Nevermind here by some band called the Nirvanas, who you may or may not have heard of. Suddenly any band that didn't dress like Warrant and didn't sing songs about boobs, boobs, boobs was being offered enormous amounts of money by the record labels, because if you had one Nirvana, you could have two. And so, bands that previously would not have had a sniff of major label placement, bands like Urge Overkill, Dinosaur Jr., all those type of acts were having money thrown at them, and they were effectively signing, bands for huge amounts of money, and then they did one album and then they got dropped. Flaming Lips were both lucky and unlucky in that respect. Hit to Death in the Future Head was, I think, one of the many albums that was born as a result of huge amounts of interest from labels in weird, quirky acts, and they were going, well, we'll scoop up all of them, and if one of them hits, we make all of our money back. This is the same thing that happened with Iron Maiden when suddenly you got bands like Def Leppard and Saxon and God knows who else being signed. It's the same thing that happens every time there's a band that spearheads through a new musical movement. Major labels were throwing lots and lots of money at other bands that were if you kind of vaguely squinted at it, looked like they might possibly be vaguely similar. And the race was on to find the next Nirvana, which is not what the Flaming Lips were at all, and we're never going to be that. So by the time that Hit to Death in the Future Head came out, the band's lineup had changed again, and so Jonathan Donahue had joined on guitar. He later went to join Mercury Rev. Nathan Roberts was on drums, and the band were recording in the same studio as a number of other bands. So you kind of think about all that stuff kind of fitting together. There was also an EP. So Flaming Lips were, I think, was very prolific, as in fact they still are to this day with material, although the past 3 years have slowed down a little bit thanks to the pandemic. And Hit to Death in the Future Head has songs such as Talking About the Smiling Death Porn, Immortality Blues, Everybody Wants to Live Forever. They are the band with probably the longest song titles compared to the length of the particular song. But that's not to say it's a bad thing. It absolutely isn't. It's just you kind of sit there and you could throw Flaming Lips song titles into an AI Flaming Lips song name generator, and you could come up with a song title like Watching My Own Funeral from Above as a Disembodied Spirit Floating Around the Graveyard, for example, which would almost definitely have been on the CD single around about this period of time, were that song actually a Flaming Lips song. And they had, again, another lineup change, and then they released Transmissions from the Satellite Heart, which is their 6th album. And this is the one where everybody started hearing what the Flaming Lips actually sounded like, because this has the song She Don't Use Jelly on, which is a song that the band still play live. It's probably the oldest song that the band play with any regularity, and it's an okay song. Sorry about that, but I've always thought of She Don't Use Jelly as being kind of like the band's equivalent of something like Presidents of the USA. I think they had a song called Lump, didn't they, or something? And you kind of end up going, it's almost a novelty song that overshadowed part of the rest of the band's activity, because if it had been the only hit the band had ever had, it would be the song that they would always have to play, and they'd always have a built-in audience as a result of it, in much the same way as EMF have Unbelievable, for example. They have a song which people was inexplicably kind of popular and an outlier compared to the rest of their activity. But it's not bad. It's just not really my type of thing. It's not even conventional. It's just slightly weird, quirky American rock, and that in itself is okay. You can see with the band changing over time, they're starting to become the Flaming Lips at this point. So I think most bands have a core creative relationship between 2 or 3 people that are in them, and you need that relationship for it to work. Occasionally you have someone like Lemmy whose core creative relationship is with himself, but most bands you have 2 or 3 people that work together that make the music happen. So, for example, I would think Suede, for example, would have in their current configuration Richard Oakes, Neil Codling and Brett Anderson. And those 3 work together in a synergy to create the music. It was around about this point that Stephen Drozd joined the band, and he joined the band. Mike and Steve came in on drums and keyboards. And then we had Ronald Jones on guitar as well, who joined the band at this point. Jonathan was out and had joined Mercury Rev. Nathan had left as well. And this is where you start to hear the start of what the Flaming Lips would become. And I think the creative relationship that we have between Stephen and Wayne is probably the most important creative relationship that there is in the Flaming Lips, in much the same way as the Beatles was Lennon McCartney and Kraftwerk was Hutter and Schneider. With Wayne and Stephen is the relationship that makes the Flaming Lips be completely unique. This is the album where the band have started to effectively shed the weight of expectations and the preconceptions of what they did previously. So as I've mentioned before, you started to see the influences have expanded and grown beyond Black Flag, Dinosaur Jr., Husker Du, those type of things, started to move beyond a kind of like a standard guitar based drums kind of thing. They've added to the palette, they've expanded it out, and I'm going to blow smoke up Stephen's ass here. He is an incredible musician, and some bands need to have that one guy who can play pretty much every instrument on the planet and make it work and be amazing at it. Stephen can do that, and although he was playing drums for the band, what it became pretty obvious was, if a guy can play any instrument, why have you got him playing drums? Why haven't you got him playing piano and keyboards and guitar and singing and doing all those type of things? And this is where the sound of the Flaming Lips, which you may now like, if you like the Flaming Lips now, is where I think it really came into its own. So they released She Don't Use Jelly as a single. It's still the only song of theirs that's got into the American Top 100 30 years later. But as the theory goes, if you have 10,000 fans and they're willing to spend £50 a year on you as a band, that's $500,000. You can make that work. Not amazingly, but you can make it work. And this was the start of, I think, where the band started to have a career and a progression and a linear narrative. It's very easy to think of when you're in a band, is that sometimes, certainly, I was listening to an interview with Trent Reznor, who was saying, well, actually, our prime concern was we make it to next month, and then hopefully next month we'll make it to the next month, and then we'll make it to the next month, and then and then you're at the point where you go, with the band's commercial success and profile, is you kind of go, we can do it till next year, we can do it for the next 2 years. If you're Axl Rose, you can go, I don't have to release an album for the rest of my life, and if I do, you're lucky. Count yourself lucky. But with the Flaming Lips, what we had, I think, was that the band were moving step by step, and then they were able to plan things out in the longer term with the more success that the band had. So we have Transmissions from the Satellite Heart, the first album, the first post Nirvana album that I think that and alongside Hit to Death, where the band had some pressure on them from Warner Brothers, and the expectation is that the band would hit and they would be successful, which obviously is something which has happened until this day in various forms, and they had many successful years with Warner Brothers. So this was released on the 22nd of June 1993. That was a Tuesday. The reason I know it's a Tuesday is because the 18th of June was a Saturday, and that was the last time that I saw The Cure with Boris Williams on drums. I don't know why I remember that. I do. Well, I do know how calendars work. And we also had an EP that was released afterwards, which is due to high expectations, the Flaming Lips are now providing needles for your balloons. And we had a couple of tracks that were on that later kind of turned up elsewhere. And we then had the album that came out afterwards. So for Transmissions from the Satellite Heart, She Don't Use Jelly was the hit. But we did have another album, and this is the last album I'm going to talk about in the early years of the Flaming Lips. It was Clouds Taste Metallic, again recorded by the lineup of Wayne, Michael, Ronald, and Stephen Drozd there. And this is the Heady Nugs 1994 to 1997 version of the album. That was the reissue that came out in 2015. So that features the original mix of Clouds Taste Metallic, the Providing Needles for Your Balloons EP, the live album, Psychiatric Explorations of the Fetals with Needles, and an extra set of rarities called The King Bug Laughs. Again, if you have these albums, which I've shown to you today, you effectively have most of the core part of the Flaming Lips early activity. There is one which you won't have, which was the Lightning Strikes the Postman remix version of Clouds Taste Metallic that was issued in 2016 as an alternate version of the album. But as it is an alternate version of the album and not actually a new album, you don't necessarily need it to complete your collection. Clouds Taste Metallic takes its name from a statement by, I think it's a member of Tool who was flying in one of those biplanes, and he goes, when you go through clouds will taste metallic. And of course, somebody in the band sat down and went, I'll write that down and we'll use that as the name for the album. I think Clouds Taste Metallic is a very good record, by the way. There's a huge quantum leap that happens shortly, but Clouds Taste Metallic is a very good album, and it's almost like you can kind of think of the section just before the Flaming Lips became the apex of their creative identity. They were still kind of chipping away bits that didn't look like Flaming Lips. And so when you had the Clouds Taste Metallic album, hang on, I'll take the booklet out here. So this set has three discs on it. The first one of which is in this plastic folder. Here it is. Clouds Taste Metallic itself. And that's a phrase that I said more today than any other day in my life and the rest of my life all combined. And then we had the second disc, and the second disc, by the way, features the High Expectations EP and the King Bug Laughs. So that's the extra tracks, which were B-sides and so on. And then the third disc is the live album, live in Seattle, 1996, Psychiatric Explorations of the Fetus with Needles. Again, not the most friendly of titles, but if you want to get a super expanded deluxe version of Clouds Taste Metallic, Heady Nugs is where to go. And the live stuff is pretty good, but you can hear very, very clearly the Flaming Lips starting to become who they were. So really leaning into the use of big dramatic keyboards and textures and sounds, and the use of non-conventional rhythms, the use of guitars as texture as opposed to driving the melody, that type of stuff. That's exactly what you've got, and it's a very good record. It's aged very well, and if you kind of think, so how did the Flaming Lips get to where they are from where they were? You really need this record to fully understand how that happened. There is one more release from this period that I own. It's not a major one. I picked it up quite cheaply, actually. It is the single for Brainville, which comes in this bizarre and unusual kind of shiny cover, and then you've got a 3-track CD. So this was one of the singles that was released in 1995. It's backed with Brainville and Raindrops Keep Falling on My Head. There is also an extra track, Bad Day, which was on the soundtrack to the terrible 1995 Batman movie, Batman Forever, which came out in 1995. The band were clearly kind of being poised for, or being groomed for is probably the wrong word, but being lined up for considerable commercial success and profile. Warner Brothers were not exactly throwing huge amounts of money at the band, but they were committing to them and saying, "We believe that you will hit and you will get the commercial return upon the money that we paid for you." So there was an investment that was still going on in those days. But the band's commercial success is what happened in a couple of albums' time. And I'll have to get to that when I do a separate episode about it. The band came to end the tour, their tour in 1996, with effectively what was the end of the first period of the Flaming Lips, the last vestiges of the band's more rocky outlook. Ronald Jones left the group, and the band didn't automatically think they needed to replace a guitarist with a guitarist. Instead, they reconfigured themselves and started to carry on as a trio of Wayne, Stephen, and Michael, who of course had been the bass player with the band since the start. That is the next period of the band. This is the early years of the Flaming Lips. If you're curious and going, well, what do they sound like? Well, it sounds like the Flaming Lips that you know and possibly love from the modern days, but with a heck of a lot more guitars and a heck of a lot less money, because that's exactly what they are. And if you want to pick up all of the stuff from this period, effectively, you really only need to buy 5 things. You need to buy Finally the Punk Rockers Are Taking Acid on CD, Shot to Death, or more correctly, The Day They Shot a Hole in the Jesus Egg, Shot to Death in the, hit, and then Transmissions from the Satellite Heart, and then you get the Heady Nugs multi-disc version, and that's pretty much it. That's the full range of early Flaming Lips stuff. Now, next time I talk about Flaming Lips, whatever that's going to be, I am going to be talking about the band's perhaps more better known stuff, the period that starts with Soft Bulletin, Race for the Prize, and Waiting for a Superman. And I have a lot more to say about that because I know those songs better and I've spent more time with them than these. But this is a really interesting set of baby steps by the band as they grew into the band that they were about to become. You can see effectively these are almost the oral equivalent of baby pictures. You can see who they're going to become, and it's a fascinating journey. Anyway, I'm going to wrap up here. I've got a really itchy nose, as you've probably already worked out. It's driving me nuts. I'm going to go off and have a good scratch like a good cat, and I will see you sometime soon. Stay beautiful and bye.